So this is the final quote-unquote lesson of the ethics unit. And I don't know, I even have a hard time calling it a lesson because there's just so many questions here that will be posed rather than answered. So these are just a couple of ideas, a few ideas that I just want to reiterate, and some of them may have been touched on earlier in the unit, but let's try to bring it back. So if you could take notes on this, again, some of the notes will just pose more questions than answers, but there's some definitions here that I think will be necessary going forward. So let's first of all talk about ethics and economic life. Running a business, running a corporation. At a time, many people thought that ethics in the business world were just an impediment to economic activity. So if you had to abide by ethical code, it was kind of a barrier to make more money for the shareholders, to make more money for the stockholders. And you look at I often think of the ethics of advertising, and I've talked about this a lot, or the ethics of selling deodorant and toothpaste and mouthwash, the use of fear to coerce someone into buying your product so they don't smell. And then if you don't smell, you might be able to get a date and have friends. I don't know. The ethics of advertising. I wonder if that's foreshadowing. The ethics of advertising your online dating site. You know, does advertising really play up on human insecurities? I kind of think they do. So ethics, or not abiding by ethics in economic life in the past decade or so, has shown us a number of scandals that have had disastrous consequences on the economy, especially in our neighbors to the south. So today, we are finding the importance of the business world to count on the existence of basic sets of morals. So we need people not to steal. We need people to pay their debts. We need people to be honest to their shareholders. Because we've had scandals, and I'm going to talk about Enron in a second, and the housing crunch with mortgage companies and banks in America in the last 10 years. It has crippled the American economy, has crippled the world economy, some would say, and has put many people out of work. So let's take a look at the Enron case. So this was, and it still jumps up into the news once in a while. Enron was a Houston-based energy company, and in 2000, beginning of 2000, it was the 7th most successful American corporation. It was based out of 40 countries, and it had 21,000 employees. Their stock value was at $90 per share. Things are looking good. But by mid-August 2000, the share price had dropped to 26 cents a share. That's huge. What a huge loss. CEOs were arrested. The vice chairman of the company died by suicide. And investors and employees lost billions. So what happened? Well, what happened was executives were hiding billions of dollars in losses in their failed business ventures. So they had pressured accountants and auditors, whether they're independent auditors and accountants or whether they worked for Enron, to hide these losses, shred these files, and erase these computer records. And by the time it was all over, it was too late to recover. So what can be done? The shareholders who invest in companies have the right to know the truth, but what mechanisms are in place, I guess, other than laws, for corporations to tell the truth. Now, recently, I don't know if you followed Edward Snowden at all. So he's the former, I don't know, spy, I guess, and has been leaking documents about American security and military documents, and has been given asylum in Europe over this. But and that the whole WikiLeaks thing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google WikiLeaks. So should there be protection for whistleblowers? So people who know something's going wrong in a corporation or a government and report it. Well, now, obviously, that's not going to make the corporation very happy, but do people have a moral obligation to report wrongdoings? I think it's hard to have whistleblower technologies or whistleblower legislation in private industries, but in government and federal operations, I could see whistleblowing legislation succeeding. So that's just the ethics of economic life in a nutshell, which leads then to professional ethics. And many careers have their own codes of ethics: doctors, nurses, teachers, lawyers. And they lay out the ethical duties that this profession must have, but ethical duties that ordinary citizens may not have to abide by. So in normal life or everyday life, it's unethical to share people's secrets. I know we do it anyways, but in some cases, lawyers and psychiatrists need to share that. Now, of course, there is the idea of client-attorney privilege, where lawyers can't disclose certain information. And then psychiatrists and psychologists, there is a certain element of confidentiality there too. However, if the patient's life is at harm, or there's thoughts of someone else's life is at harm, the psychiatrist may have to report that. Now, that is usually laid out before any session with a psychologist or psychiatrist, that they may have to report. And then we could get into the ethics of the legal profession and being a lawyer. Is it ethical to represent someone who you know is guilty? Or is it your job to represent that person to make sure their rights were withheld? Is that the ethical code you abide by? Or is it a moral ethical code? And that's a conversation I would like to have with some lawyers. I watch a lot of legal shows. The Good Wife brings that up quite a bit. And one, I don't have the intellect to be a lawyer, and I don't know if I could represent someone who I knew. I don't know. If their rights, I don't know. Something to think about. Could you do that? So the purpose of an ethical code within a given profession is not to uphold the principles, but it's a way to govern behavior. So if you violate an ethical code, that could be grounds for dismissal or grounds for discipline. So earlier in the unit, I shared with you the ethical standards for the teaching profession. And they are pretty, I think they're pretty open to interpretation. Let me just quickly go over the 4 ethical standards for teaching in Ontario. So the first one's care. So this includes compassion, acceptance, interest, and insight for developing students' potential. Members express their commitment to students' well-being and learning through positive influence, professional judgment, and empathy in practice. 2, respect. It's intrinsic in the ethical standard of respect or trust and fair-mindedness. Members honor human dignity, emotional wellness, and cognitive development. In their professional practice, they model respect for spiritual and cultural values, social justice, confidentiality, freedom, democracy, and the environment. Trust, number 3. The ethical standard of trust embodies fairness, openness, and honesty. Members' professional relationships with students, colleagues, parents, guardians, and the public are based on trust. And 4, integrity. Honesty, reliability, and moral action are embodied in the ethical standard of integrity. Continual reflection assists members in exercising integrity in their professional commitments and responsibilities. So to me, these are pretty wide open and open to a lot of interpretation. But if I were to violate one of those 4, I would be put up on review or teacher performance appraisal, and I guess that could lead to discipline or even dismissal. So it'll be interesting where your career takes you and what ethical standards you might have to abide by, or may not have to, but want to abide by even. Now, okay, so we've moved from ethics in economic life to ethics in professional life. Just want to talk about the ethics and the proximity principle. So the proximity principle is the degree of moral responsibility we have to a person is proportional to our relational closeness to that person. So, I'll try to explain that. We tend to feel morally responsible for those who are close to us, both emotionally and physically, and less morally responsible for those who are further away. And some suggest it's hard to be morally responsible for things that happen too far away from us. But can we really say that distance has no role in moral obligation? So historically, we saw or witnessed the Holocaust. We witnessed the Rwandan genocide. And there's a certain distance there. Do we have a moral obligation to intervene? I'll get to that in a second. Now, some of the consumer choices we make, does that have an impact or a consequence on workers in the third world, in the developing world? What if I like cheap coffee? Does that impact farmers in Colombia? You saw, where was that? Bangladesh? India? The collapse of a Joe Fresh factory. And we saw the working conditions of that factory and how unsafe it was. So do consumer choices to buy clothes that you know are made in the third world, does that have an impact? So Joe Fresh is the clothing company sold out of places like No Frills or the Loblaws brand or chain of stores. I think too often I turn a blind eye to looking at the tag of where things were made, because I'm guided on price. Something to definitely think about Are we going to start? Are you willing to start paying for clothes that have the certification that it's fair trade and that it's sweatshop free? It's a sweatshop free product. I don't know. And that's hard because, again, the proximity principle, we live so far away from those workers in Bangladesh, in Cambodia, um, or from those farmers in Colombia that maybe it's easier for us to turn a blind eye to some of those injustices. But yet, if I was teaching some of these kids who are working in a factory in downtown Renfrew and I knew some injustices were happening, would it be easier for me to act? Again, more questions than answers. So if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda or um, Shake Hands with the Devil or read the biography of Romeo Dallaire about the Rwandan genocide. And there's a quote out there about the worst thing society can do when they know there's an injustice is do nothing. I can't think of who said that. Gandhi? Not sure. So if we knew this is happening, is it our responsibility, this genocide, to go in and protect it? Or is it up to the responsibility of that sovereign government or that sovereign state to do that themselves? So after the Rwandan genocide, so almost 1 million people died, 800,000 lives at least over 6 weeks. Canada, the government, with the request of the UN, formed the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. So the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. And this was drafted in September 2000. So some of the core principles here in the responsibility to protect. So just two ideas here from this report. One, that state sovereignty, so like the state as a country in and itself and can control itself. State sovereignty implies responsibility, and the primary responsibility for the protection of its people lies within the state itself. So first and foremost, it was up to the government of Rwanda to protect its people. Point B then says, though, if a population is suffering serious harm as a result of this internal war or this insurgency or the repression or state failure, and the state in question is unwilling or unable to halt or avert it, the principle of non-intervention yields to the international responsibility to protect. So if a country is not protecting its citizens, it kind of forfeits that right, and the international community should become involved. So can we apply the same sort of principles to Syria? Why have people been slow to respond to Syria? Well, as we've seen, it's quite complicated. And there's oil interests involved too, which impedes or slows down some other states' willingness to get involved. It's so complicated. But I find that really interesting. In some sovereign states, say it's not up to places like the United States and G7 countries to get involved. You're not the world police. But according to this document, again, if a country cannot protect its citizens because of an internal war, then it's up to the international community to get involved. Finally, and we talked about this earlier this week with the ethics of animal treatment, is just the idea of environmental ethics. So I think all of us can agree that we have a moral obligation to each other, to humans. do we have an obligation to other forms of life on the planet to ethically treat animals, plants? I'd like to think I do, but do those ethical questions really play in a role in how I consume food? I like meat. I like bacon. But if you look at these factory farms that are popping up, are the animals really being treated ethically? When you're looking at a pig farm and pigs are so cramped so they don't have the ability to turn around because they're so enclosed with other pigs, is that ethical? I like bacon, but do we have an obligation? And should those ethics dictate our consumer choices? And so many documentaries that I watch, Forks Over Knives, Food Nation, it almost encourages me to be a vegetarian, but I don't know if I'm ready for that. I like meat. And diets like the paleo diet or the 17-day diet really encourage protein intake. And yeah, I struggle with that. The term anthropocentric, so that's ANTHROPOCENTRIC, essentially means we are human-centered and that we have human ethical responsibilities above all other life forms. Anthropocentric, human-centered, and that we have human ethical responsibilities above all other duties. But then the ethicist Peter Singer says, but we're all animals. We're all mammals. Shouldn't we treat mammals the same as we would treat other humans? Again, more questions than answers. That is going to conclude our content portion of the unit, and tomorrow I will lay out I guess a paper or a project you're going to write about ethics, and I'll give you 3 periods, I guess, to work on that. I hope it's not too frustrating that there's more questions than answers here, but I hope it's allowing your brain to work and to stretch. Thank you very much for listening.